waste time on the honourable gentleman, right honourable gentleman, but I think I will. He excited us all by the way he put down his beaker of water. We weren't sure whether it was going to survive its time during his speech as he got overexcited. We enjoyed what he read, but he didn't have time to look at the OBR, Officer of Budget Responsibility, whose headline I may read: Budget extends rescue measures, stokes economic recovery and begins fiscal repair job. The economy is set to rebound thanks to rapid vaccine rollout, getting back to its pre-pandemic peak by the end of next year. Extending rescue measures takes support for households, businesses and public services to 344 billion. Generous tax incentives for business investment stoke the recovery over the next 2 years. Then medium-term tax rises and cuts to spending plans all but balance day-to-day spending with revenues and see underlying debt fall relative to national income. But risks remain upon the virus, legacy costs of public services and future interest rates. I think that balances what the leader of the SNP in this House said. I haven't had time to read all the budget documents, but I think I'm right in saying there's no mention of leasehold, common hold, cladding loans, or ways of coping with the excess property insurance premiums being faced by leaseholders. There's no attention yet to the Association of Residential Management Agents, who asked for a scheme which will cover the excess costs. With premiums going up by 400 to 600%, action is needed. Can I, so to speak, interrupt myself to take an opportunity to pay tribute to Jane Sinclair, Canon Jane Sinclair, who was rector, the first woman rector of St Margaret's in Parliament Square, who died in January. She was greatly loved in this House. She worked to re-establish the parliamentary links with the Speaker's chaplain, and she also had a reputation for liveliness, humour and effectiveness. But I understand she was once nominated to be the Rotherham Businesswoman of the Year. We miss her and we send our sympathy to Julian Cooper, her partner. Returning to the budget, I'm glad that the chairman of the Select Committee spoke about the dangers of inflation. The Chancellor will be aware of this. There are two groups who I think matter a great deal when considering this, besides the question of who can get jobs. And by the way, I think it would have been kind if the SNP, even the leader of the opposition, had welcomed the news from the Chancellor that the number of people who were out of work did not rise to the levels that was in part a reflection of government measures, but in large part because of the way people buckled down, got on with life as much as they could, and by the government's courage in keeping things like the construction industry open, which made a great deal of difference to the supply side of products as well. While thinking of those affected by potential inflation, mortgage holders are one group, and the second are the elderly, many of whom are on fixed incomes. Although their incomes during the pandemic may have kept up, in real terms they drop if inflation returns. So I hope that we don't get to the 2% inflation, which is the government's, part of the government's instructions to the Bank of England. While on leaseholders, I believe that under the coronavirus powers, government should put a temporary stop to forfeiture of residential leaseholds. During that time, they ought to make sure that any substitute arrangements do not let the landlord, or freeholder it may be, take the whole of the equity in a forfeited lease. That is scandalous. It's going back to William I in the worst possible feudal way. If a home has to, or a leasehold has to be repossessed, any excess equity should and must, in justice, go to the person who's losing their home. I hope that officials will take note of that and discuss it among government and take action. I hope that we all recognise that, as the Honourable Gentleman of the SNP said, government has done more to bring some of the self-employed into the support schemes. There aren't enough. I don't want to use all my time by reading out all the points made in the website of Excluded UK, but I do recommend that website to people. In the same way in the hospitality, I know that motorists will be grateful for the fact that with the petrol and diesel going up, the chance of not adding to that by extra taxation at the moment. My prediction, as someone who drinks and I try not to do it when I'm driving, is that in fact the revenues from spirits, from wine and from beer are likely to go up. And I believe that having duty rates which are frozen is a better way of getting extra revenue in. We ought to pay attention to what a tax rate is as well as what a tax take is. One of the curiosities about our national economic discussion is that those people like my former supervisor, although I was his worst pupil, Professor Sir James Mirrlees, did a calculation of what he thought the appropriate tax rate was. When he was young, he thought it was about 27%. By the time he got older, he'd become a bit more socialist and thought it was about 33%. We're running at 38%. And I believe that both the level of taxation and the rates of taxation deserve to have better public discussion. I hope the Chancellor can have forums which will do that. One of my constituents suggested the Chancellor should consider having separate tax codes for different key workers as a way of recognising their contribution. I said you'll always have a boundary problem, but then I said you always have a boundary problem in whatever you do in any form of life. One particular area where my constituents have been eyes and ears for me are a couple who ran a hospitality business on a river. They had to pay high fees to the Environment Agency for the ability to run their business. They don't have business rates, but the Environment Agency and DEFRA haven't yet managed to discover who it is who could say that they have a rebate on these licence fees they have not been able to use for most of the last 12 months. Just because you don't have a shop front doesn't mean to say there aren't costs which could be waived by government or by government agencies. I know that many people want to speak in this debate. I wanted to make the point that if we can recognise the contributions that people are making in their enterprises, we're more likely to have a hospitality sector in particular where people who've put landladies and landlords who put their hearts into and broken their hearts by throwing away stocks and gallons of beer twice in the last 12 months will be able to come back into operation. And I'd ask all my constituents not to have a drink on me, but go out and have a drink, whether alcoholic or not, with their friends when they can, and put this country back on its feet in our social lives as well as in our business lives.
Hear, hear.
Meg Hillier.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in parts, I welcome this budget because it props up the system for a bit longer if it works. But I am worried that we've seen announcements about, for example, the extension of furlough at a point where many workers will have already been hit by decisions by their employers, worried that this announcement would not be made today. But the country is crying out for change. The country is in debt. There is an uncertain future for many individuals and businesses. Brexit, I didn't think I heard it mentioned in the Chancellor's speech, is hitting businesses and individual consumers very hard and proving costly to the economy, certainly in this short term. And the bit that was missing is the vision for a country that should be supporting people into decent, affordable homes, that should be properly tackling net zero, which I'll touch on in more detail, which should have a sector that was abandoned at the early stages of COVID, and should be tackling the challenging issues around different employment status that has caused so much difficulty for so many. Everything in my constituency represented, actually, from 0 hours contracts, IR35, self-employment, employed for tax purposes only, people on short-term contracts. Different people have had different impacts as a result of COVID. The Chancellor said he'll do whatever it takes, but structurally the inequalities remain. The poorest had a welcome prop-up on the universal credit being the uplift being extended, but only to September. I'm not sure, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can see, and I'm not sure that the Chancellor would, I'm sure he'd agree, he doesn't have a crystal ball, about what will suddenly change in September that means that you can don't need the extra £20 a week. And structurally, there are real issues here. There are a few figures announced today, I haven't had a chance to go through the detail in the Red Book, on green initiatives. But there's not a clear plan. We've got targets on net zero, on environmental targets, including things like electric cars or net zero cars, and yet there are not enough milestones along the way to these targets which are coming upon us really fast. So this will be looking at in detail as my committee, the Public Accounts Committee, is examining in a series of inquiries issues around the green economy. But I do welcome, finally, a bit more support for some of the self-employed people in my constituency. We need to see the detail, but it is late. It is a whole year late. And I, like many, have constituents who have lived for a year without a penny of income, and they didn't qualify for universal credit, and sometimes we're in exactly the same position as somebody else who lost their job only a day later. Lives have been put on hold, future plans shredded, and there's no prospect of work for many of these people in many sectors for many months. I welcome investment in HMRC and DWP looking at fraud and error. These are small amounts, but it was this very government that put bounce-back loans through, as the National Audit Officer said, with very little regard to risk. A slight delay of 24 or 48 hours would have put less risk on the taxpayer for the guarantee on those loans. And some of the furlough schemes, at the early stages, it was right to get it out the door, as my committee has acknowledged, but later, more safety mechanisms could have been put in place. So that money is good money chase specs. The risk appetite was high. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I think
By the fact that so many people are stuck in homes that are unsaleable, worth nothing, and are mortgage prisoners. So the whole supply system isn't working, and the demand system is being fuelled in the wrong direction. So, we've seen homes in my constituency which were being sold at just below the last threshold for this. And my committee has looked at the government's housing policies over many years now. 1 million new homes in England were promised between 2015 and 2020, and another 500,000 more by the end of 2022. Even taking into account the pandemic, we see, for example, the Starter Homes project fail completely after nearly £200 million was spent on land remediation alone, and £2.3 billion in total was set aside for that in the 2015 spending review. And yet the government, this didn't happen, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the government didn't even manage to enact the secondary legislation necessary to get it off the ground. And 5 years later, it finally announced that it was the end of starter homes and introduced first homes, a discount for first-time buyers. Now we're seeing a loan guarantee. It's a very muddled policy. I can't see yet who will benefit, and we'll be looking at this in detail. And on the issue I touched on earlier, on net zero and environmental targets, there are big targets the government is setting, but our detailed work on the Public Accounts Committee raises many concerns. This is on top of failures of the Green Deal, the privatisation of the Green Investment Bank, 3 competitions for carbon capture and storage, and 1 more recently announced that so far the first 3 have failed, and real inertia on developing proper long-term commitments to really tackling climate change. It's easy to make an announcement. I won't give away, I've already taken 2 interventions, but it's easy to make announcements. It's much harder to get the system to deliver on these. And there is a will in this House, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, to deliver on this, but the government has got to stop making cheap headlines. And on jobs, we're seeing only 1 in 100 young people aged 16 to 24 benefiting from Kickstart. Again, a nice headline, but unless it delivers for our constituents, it is not working. And we need to act now on making sure that FE is properly funded so it can plan ahead as we come, hopefully, out of lockdown and into a more normal life, and make sure that people are able to be reskilled. And finally, I welcome the movement, as far as I've read the detail, which isn't in full detail yet, of visas for tech entrepreneurs. This has been a break on progress in Shoreditch, in my constituency. However, we have young people in this country who have been brought up in the UK, for whom it is their home, the only country they know. They are struggling to buy citizenship at over £1,000 apiece because families just can't afford it. They may pay for citizenship for the main householder, but not for the family. This is something that I feel is viscerally unjust, and we have this in our constituencies, in our country, who are essentially British but priced out of citizenship. So if we're going to have visas for tech entrepreneurs at an easy rate, why don't we do this for the young people already in our country, willing, able and capable of contributing?
Sajid Javid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Over the course of the past year, in countries not too dissimilar to our own, people have been asked to choose between protecting their livelihoods or protecting their lives. That has not been the case in our country, and for that we have my right honourable friend to thank. He said right at the very start of this pandemic that he would do whatever it takes to protect jobs, to protect businesses, to protect public health, and he has delivered on every bit it's given him its gratitude. Now, despite his success, the Chancellor will be in no mood for a victory lap. Comprehensive support, as he has said today, has come at unprecedented pressure to our public finances. To date, as we heard, the government has already spent more than £300 billion, every penny of that borrowed. And now, whilst low interest rates have certainly helped, we cannot expect such a benign lending environment to last forever. With national debt already close to national output, as we heard, just a 1% rise in gilt would mean an additional yearly cost of debt servicing of £25 billion by 2024. That's more than half of the annual defence budget. And indeed, we're already seeing rising pressure, especially because of rising global inflation expectations. So we cannot allow the inflation tiger to prowl unchecked. Madam Deputy Speaker, the faster our economy can bounce back, the easier it will be to manage our debt in the future. Thankfully, I believe that our prospects for a sharp, strong recovery look very promising. Thanks to government support, the vast majority of businesses are ready for the shutters of the economy to be lifted. The Bank of England has shored up £1 billion of excess savings, and unlike wartime recessions, there has been no physical destruction. The government is delivering on its vaccination programme, a programme that is the envy of Europe, and it will lead this continent out of the lockdown. And so for these reasons, I'm very optimistic about the recovery, and I think it
way. I thank my right honourable friend for Bromsgrove giving way, and he of course was part of the legacy that's put us in a strong position to make the support packages that my friend the Chancellor has. Would he agree with me that small businesses are the absolute lifeblood of our recovery, and that my right honourable friend the Chancellor has brought forward in the Helping Businesses Grow package today two really insightful schemes that will support the nation's smallest businesses?
I thank his comments, and I very much agree with that. And I think actually more than two schemes, if we're honest, a number of schemes that will help businesses, not least the speed and the scale of the recovery that I've talked of. And I especially welcome those measures, but also the super deduction and the support through grants for businesses as well. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the medium term, we will put our country back onto a more firmer financial footing by tackling some of the systemic issues that were around long before this pandemic hit us, such as low productivity and regional inequality. That's why I'd like to welcome also the Chancellor's emphasis on infrastructure investment. Not only will this provide an immediate increase in economic activity, but it will also drive long-term productivity improvements, and it will make sure that growth is even better distributed across the entire United Kingdom. But I would urge him not to take his eye off delivery. Successive governments have had a poor history of the delivery of and on budget. So I hope that my right honourable friend will consider complementing his very welcome changes to the Green Book, the new comprehensive cross-government delivery strategy. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, while grants and support schemes have been consumed by our generation, they will be paid for by the next. And that's why the Chancellor was absolutely right to level with the British people and to set out so candidly the pressure on the nation's finances. While slamming the brakes on spending now would be self-defeating, the government should be drawing up plans to manage debt. And that's why I welcome many of the initiatives the Chancellor set out today, including his commitment to try to avoid borrowing for day-to-day spending. But this commitment, I think, starts with the Chancellor should ensure that these rules are in place by year-end, ideally alongside the next budget and the comprehensive spending review. Having run 4 spending departments and the Treasury, I'm left in no doubt that a fiscal anchor is essential to control spending and to control debt. And lastly, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the long term, putting the country back on a firm financial footing means that we need to build resilience against future disasters, as the Chancellor recognised in his budget speech. Now, of course, not every disaster is a black swan, and it would be that we cannot foresee whilst we are ignoring those that we can. So in terms of their potential impact on the future economy, few crises are more climate change and declining biodiversity. That's why, as Chancellor, I set Professor Dasgupta very ambitious terms for the independent review that he did on the economics of biodiversity. It makes clear that biodiversity is declining faster than at any other time in human history. If we continue to undermine the resilience of the natural world, we will introduce new sources of serious financial uncertainty, not least of which the increased spread of infectious diseases. Now, whilst of course it will take time for the Treasury to digest Professor Treasury should make a start on one of his most central recommendations, the need to recognise the value of the natural world in our national accounts. I would urge the Chancellor to formally ask the UK Statistics Authority to review how this might be done. The ONS is one of the most widely respected economic institutions in the world. If it can lead by example, it can make such a difference in trying to persuade other countries and financial institutions to do the same. We can lead on this, not least because of our chairmanship of the G7 and the COP26 conference this year. Madam Deputy Speaker, this has been a long, hard winter, and we have all been hibernating for many months. But as case rates fall and the vaccination programme continues at pace, the frost has begun to thaw, and we are beginning to see the first signs of spring. The government has been given a precious opportunity. I am in no doubt that the Chancellor will rise to the occasion with the energy that this moment requires and the sense of purpose that I am pleased to say that his budget is the first step to doing just that.
Thank you. We now go by video link to Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to be able to speak in this budget debate, but sadly this budget does not reflect the reality of people's lives. I've just come this morning from a local food bank. People queuing up to try to get enough food to get by. People that thought they would always be okay, they would have enough money to live on, but they don't, and therefore they rely on food banks. To the tens of thousands of people that have volunteered in mutual aid groups all over this country, I think we should say a huge thank you. They have contributed in a way that the government has not to the lives of so many people that would be in such a great difficulty if those food banks were not there. And when the Chancellor talks about extending the furlough scheme and protecting people on those wages, I point out to him that the scheme includes no floor within it. Therefore, 80% of minimum wage is a lot less than the money people need to live on. It was my friend, the member for Hayes and Harlington, who a year ago proposed that we have a furlough scheme, and he sent substantial papers to the Treasury in order to bring that about. Sadly, I don't believe the Chancellor read the whole of them, because the scheme proposed everybody's income and jobs would have had a floor to it and would have gone on to protect people's conditions and wages, as well as those in all aspects of self-employment, including in the artistic sector. Yet, there are many people in work at the moment who are being threatened with fire and rehire, where companies and worse working conditions. British Gas, for example, British Airways tried it on, and so many other companies are trying to do the same thing. Where is the protection for people's living standards and jobs in this budget? Sadly, it is desperately missing from it. On public sector pay, many are going to be hit by the pay freeze, by a stealth income tax rise, by the freezing of the tax allowance, which I remind the Chancellor, a previous government, a Labour government in the 1970s, came a cropper on that one when the Rooker-Wise amendment was passed to prevent the Chancellor from freezing the tax-free allowance. Millions of public sector workers who contributed so much to dealing with the COVID pandemic. Those working in our National Health Service, in our care services, and our local government have made inhuman efforts to try to help people get through a desperate time, helping people through the mental health crisis and so much else. And their reward is going to be frozen pay. And for those working in local government, a continued underfunding of local government services, and for pretty well everyone across the country, a 5% rise in council tax as local councils desperately try to balance the books and deal with the increased demands on their services because of the COVID pandemic. And so I hope that the Chancellor will recognise that we do need a proper funding formula for local services and not just claps for the NHS and the care service and the delivery workers, but actual pay increases for them to recognise the massive contribution that they are making to our society. The budget said a great deal about corporation tax and other business taxes, but it didn't say very much about tax evasion or tax avoidance. From the government statements, they propose to raise somewhere around 2.2 billion between now and 2025, in the next 4 years, from tax avoidance and tax evasion. Yet the real figure is somewhere over £30 billion per year that's lost tax avoidance and tax evasion. If this government was serious, it would have included measures within this budget to deal with tax avoidance and tax evasion. And so I hope, by contrast, the government will recognise that not increasing statutory sick pay, whilst at the same time doing nothing about tax evasion and tax avoidance, says it all about Tory priorities. Statutory sick pay, £95 per week. The Secretary of State for Health himself said he couldn't live on that. I don't think any member of the House of Commons would want to try and live on that. So why are we expecting anybody else to within our society? It has to be increased, as does a guarantee rise in universal credit, which is at the moment still there as a temporary measure. The Chancellor had obviously read quite a lot of my friend, the member for Hayes and Harlington's proposals before the last election, in which he pointed out that he wanted to move jobs to the north and he wanted to ensure that the increase in public spending that we were proposing would help people all across the north. And so he's made a big deal about 750 jobs going to Darlington. Sadly, all that is cancelled out by the huge number of job losses on transport authorities all across the north of England, particularly in Greater Manchester and Merseyside City region, where the government has not provided the funding package to support their transport systems that they have provided for London and other places. And so this degree of unfairness between the north and south will continue. The degree of unfairness between the richest and the poorest with our society will increase under this budget. Towards the end of his speech, the Chancellor managed to give us a great deal of greenwash of his proposals. Of course, we all support a green industrial revolution. It was central to Labour's manifesto at the last election. But where's the commitment on net zero emissions by 2030? Where's the commitment on protection of biodiversity to protect us all for the future? Mr. Speaker, this budget is such a lost opportunity. At the end of it, our society will be more divided than it is at the present time. There'll be greater stress and uncertainty amongst so many people's lives because of this budget. Mr. Speaker, we can, should and must do much better than this.
Thank you. A point of order, Sajid Javid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think at the start of my contribution, I should have reminded the House of my entries in the members' register of interest, and I hope I can put that on the record now.
Okay, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his point of order. It is essential that he should have drawn the House's attention to that, and he has done so in an almost. I thank him for it. We now go by video link to Catherine Fletcher.
Thank you so much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Back last year, I asked the Prime Minister on behalf of the good people of South Ribble to throw the kitchen sink at supporting the British PIC. And today, this Conservative Chancellor has continued to do just that. Kitchen sinks are being thrown. The scale of the financial support we're offering is massive. We're extending our spending to help people and businesses much further than many expected, right through to September and beyond. Helping businesses to survive with furlough and VAT cuts, supporting them to get back on their feet with restart grants. 407 billion quid. It's a lot of money to help this country in its time of need. It was the Conservatives, remember, who spoke a decade ago of getting the nation's finances sorted. We were fixing the roof when the sun was shining. Well, This once-in-a-century global pandemic is the weather equivalent of it raining stair rods. Cats and dogs have fallen from loaded dark grey clouds on the British people during this pandemic. Businesses have been forced to close or work in different ways to save our lives. Our existential British right to talk a load of nonsense down a pub on a Friday night with friends and strangers has been curtailed, not to mention the brilliant people that run these businesses. This Chancellor and government know what they're doing. We get that we couldn't have a situation where people lost their jobs or their hard work for businesses just because some bat in China got a nasty cough a couple of years ago. That's not their fault. It's not your fault. And this government has done eye-wateringly massive things quickly to protect you and your family and your work from the consequences of bats and biology. So it's also honest to say that this help has cost us the government has been fair in protecting people when the awful things happen. But the money sums, ooh, wow, massive. So it's our money, and costing us a fortune. I do mean us. It's not government money. It's not some nebulous concept. It's our money raised by our taxes on our hard work and our business innovation. And at some point, we're going to have to pay this massive support back. Not all in one go and not at any price. But I commend the Chancellor's honesty today in setting out two broad themes on how to keep us on an even keel with our money and the nation's finances. As individuals, we're going to have to push back some potential gains to future years, like with freezing the points in salaries where we pay a bit more tax, like asking the bigger businesses to contribute a bit more without making us as a country too different from our international peers in the G7. As government, we'll have to continue to be careful in how we spend our money. But when we do spend money, spend it to invest. And this statement shows that we'll focus on areas that will help us grow as businesses, grow as communities. We're putting in place the foundations for a future economy to boing back, never mind bounce. Today's announcements of investment, super deductions and capital investment plans are huge, boosting business investment by enormous sums with world-leading measures. This government supporting you to invest to grow your business, creating good jobs across the country. Measures today, such as the UK Infrastructure Bank in Leeds, wrong side of the Pennines, but still amazing, or the Levelling Up Fund. It will make the UK and Lancashire the best place in the world for innovative businesses to set up and grow. Free ports will help us get our goods to the world, and Help to Grow is brilliant. It will give everyone access to new skills and technologies and boost their businesses, no matter how small they are. You know, I would have absolutely run with open arms to these measures when I was running my business, Madam Deputy Speaker. And on a personal note, the people of Leyland want me to, for the investment of £25 million announced today in our town. For too long, Leyland's not seen. And recently, local businesses, local officials, elected people like me, and experts from government have been working really hard together in the town board to put a bid together to transform our town centre. I'm so chuffed it was successful. Thank you. I can't wait to get spades in the ground and get started. And in today's debate, it's also important to note I have the honour of following the Right Honourable Gentleman for somewhere in London, Islington. If only to point out where his crazy spending plans would have put us in the middle of this crisis. In short, a mess. These plans, which the front bench opposite supported in their manifesto, would have done a black hole bigger than this pandemic has in our nation's finances, with the pandemic then deepening it. The Labour Party just aren't being honest or straight with the public when they suggest we can just borrow our way out of this.
Video link to Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's an honour to follow the honourable member. I think we all appreciate that the Chancellor's statement today comes far-reaching, in some cases life-changing, even life-ending consequences for far too many of our constituents. People who have seen the well-planned, well-financed future they had built for their families swept away by this virus. Businesses now on the brink, because they responsibly followed the rules laid down by the government. And while there are some steps in this budget which I'm sure will be welcomed, it does not, for me, go far enough for the many who have suffered the most. Those, for example, on lower incomes, for whom the freeze on the tax threshold will mean a real terms loss in their income. Madam Deputy Speaker, today, 1 million small business owners who have been fighting desperately to stay afloat and protect jobs and livelihoods were looking to the Chancellor to extend to them a lifeline to do the next few months and out of the other side of this pandemic. And while there will be changes to corporation tax in 2 years' time, that is 2 years' time, what about tomorrow, next week, next month? And I'm sorry, but I believe that what we've heard today falls far short of what those small businesses needed. Florists, who are the backbone of our economy, the heart of our communities, we need to get them through the next few months, and they needed changes now. They have lost income, revenue to pay the rent costs which are building up, the debt which they are accruing through this. £5 billion for small businesses is not enough. What the Chancellor has announced doesn't even touch the sides of the problem. What we needed, and what Liberal Democrats have been calling for, is a £50 billion recovery fund, which would help small businesses meet their costs, replace their lost revenue until they are able to trade properly again, until the economy is opened. £25 billion over 3 months, £50 billion. We've seen it can succeed in Germany. We also called on the Chancellor to implement a zero business rates policy for all small businesses. I'd like to see that stay in place until the end of the VAT deferral would allow them to free up capital to invest in their business. The extensions to furlough, to self-employed support and to universal credit all needed to go much further. Furlough should be extended for as long as we need it, and all self-employed and excluded should be brought into it. Too many people who've been left out will remain so after this budget. There are 3 million people who have had no financial support at all in this crisis, and only 600,000 of them, by the Chancellor's own figures, will be helped. APPG on gaps in support in this Parliament gave the Chancellor a plan which would have helped those left out. Why did he not take it? And as for the universal credit uplift, even with it, the UK still has one of the least generous social welfare systems, and we all know is seriously flawed. And the uplift is due to end when the unemployment could rise again as the furlough scheme that has kept it down comes to an end. So when will this government listen to the voices across the country from all political parties who are calling for pilots, trial schemes of a universal basic income, which would have meant that nobody would have fallen through the cracks in this crisis? So now we all look to September and wait for the Chancellor's next batch of patches. I am left, Madam Deputy Speaker, today with far too few answers and too many questions. Why is our economic performance so much worse than others? Why is support for small businesses and self-employed so little, especially for those so hard hit by Brexit? There's no rates. Why nothing on social care and carers? Why so unambitious on our future green industries? There's no tax incentives for transitioning away from a carbon economy. And there's nothing to replace the Green Homes Grant. But there is, as I said, a tax hike on the lowest paid by freezing the threshold next year. And to simply mitigate the problems caused by COVID does not repair the economy or provide the investment for the growth that we need for recovery. Madam Deputy Speaker, small businesses, families, self-employed people up and down this country today were watching, hoping for something to repay their commitment, their sacrifice in fighting this pandemic. A fair response from the government, not self-congratulations on having done so well. The Chancellor, at the beginning of his statement, promised us a budget to meet the moment.
David Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start by associating myself with the comments of the Leader of the House on the excluded UK issue, helping them, and on the leaseholder issue, which is also requires help. And can I also say, associate myself with those on both sides of the House who have called for rendering permanent of the uplift to universal credit. I think in due course that will prove sensible. When I applied for this debate a few days ago, given the Chancellor's strategy, in view of my concerns that a sudden increases in taxes would crush any recovery. So it's a pleasure today to find that's not the case and that I can be much more supportive of my right honourable friend. Obviously, COVID-19 has led to incredibly difficult economic circumstances. The country has suffered the worst peacetime economic shock ever. Indeed, we have, I think, the worst outcome in the G7 too. And the deficit is the worst since 1944, which of itself is extraordinary, a date which I'll come back to. So the Chancellor faces quite remarkable economic problems, worse than any previous Chancellor, as I say, in peacetime history. And I may say he has handled it with remarkable sensitivity in the way he has put his policies together. I'll have a question about one or two, but broadly speaking, he's met this economic challenge of enormous magnitude. But enormous magnitude, what do these numbers mean? These billions and trillions that are casually thrown about by supposedly expert commentators are incredibly difficult for ordinary people to understand. And in my view, they're best understood by looking at them against the impact, as it were, by household or by wage earner, because that gives you a better idea of what they mean. So, for example, the latest deficit figures published before today were £394 billion a year. That's £14,000 per household. £14,000 per household. That's the size of the black hole we have to fill. Well, just looking at the size of the number tells you that no tax policy can solve it. The idea of imposing £14,000 per household of taxes is a nonsense. It would be designed to destroy any economic recovery. Only a recovery policy designed to restore the tax base and remove the need for subsidies will close that gap. Restore the tax base is the only way to do it. And I'm pleased to see that the Chancellor has essentially adopted that strategy. Similarly with debt. We've got the most recent estimates of well over 2 trillion, maybe 3 trillion. 2 trillion or thereabouts amounts to £77,000 per household. I remember only a few days ago the BBC commentator talking about paying off the overdraft. Well, I don't have an overdraft of 77,000. This is a big mortgage that you don't pay off in 1 year. So to pay off such a debt rapidly would be crippling. And again, the size says it all. It has to be paid off in the very long term, the Chancellor himself said, over decades. Now, since it's the worst debt and deficit combination since 1944, we should treat it the same way as they did then, with a 50-year time horizon on the loan, if you like, a war loan. Both of the World War I and World War II debts were paid off this century, within the last 20 years. So that gives us an indication of what needs to be done. And frankly, just as an aside here, I've had a number of people say, oh, well, the interest rates might go up. To a very large extent, two things are happening here. One, every single country in the world's got this issue, and therefore every single government in the world has an incentive to hold the interest rates down, and they now have the mechanisms to do it. With quantitative easing, they do it time and time again, even before today. And to close that 14,000 per household deficit, we need to do what? We need to increase growth, we need to increase employment, and all of those things will increase the tax base. And the Chancellor said, I'm glad to hear him say it, that his first priority was employment. That's the centre of those aims, and that is exactly right. That requires, of course, higher domestic investment to achieve it. It requires higher foreign inward investment to achieve it. It requires higher new company formation, higher research and development, and it will then in turn generate higher aggregate demand. Tax increases help none of these. So this issue about tax increases is not a Tory ideological issue, it's an issue about what delivers the recovery. Now, income taxes increases, obviously, whether they're direct or whether they're stealthy, reduce aggregate demand. They reduce things, deter both domestic investment and foreign investment. And the one thing I worried about in this budget was the proposal to go to a 25% corporation tax in a couple of years. That will have precisely the deterrent effect I worry about with respect to inward investment. I'm looking at the honourable member, I want to call him Sammy, I can't, who is nodding at me because, of course, in the province, this is absolutely a central issue for us all. So we have to worry about tax increases from that point of view. I was very pleased to hear from the Chancellor that his emphasis on what he called the science superpower strategy. And as he said, it's not hubristic. We are the country with the highest number of Nobel Prizes per capita in the world, and therefore we should be able to marshal something out of that. He talked about, we've had already an announcement on setting up of our equivalent of DARPA, ARIA, new strategies, new funding for science, and new tech visas. All of these things will help us all, the whole kingdom, in terms of improving our growth rate. But what is a growth strategy worth? It's very difficult sometimes, particularly dealing with the Treasury, who's very difficult about dynamic taxation. It really doesn't seem to understand it, despite the fact the British Treasury under Nigel Lawson created the best dynamic tax demonstrator in history.
Order, I'm afraid the honourable gentleman has come to the end of his time. Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, can I first of all welcome this budget and welcome the reminder which at the end of his speech that this budget and indeed the actions which have been taken by the government over the last year give an indication of the value of the Union. And I look at the details which have been given in the budget paper itself, where in Northern Ireland over 250,000 people are having their wages paid through the furlough scheme. 200,000 self-employed people are supported as a result of the scheme. That £1.5 billion worth of loans have been made available to businesses in Northern Ireland, and the Northern Ireland Executive has benefited by over £3 billion in Barnett consequentials, which has enabled them to put in place bespoke schemes in Northern Ireland. So I think that for anyone listening to this, it is a good reminder that being part of the 5th largest economy in the world has economic benefits, and economic benefits which can't be replaced through any other arrangement. The second thing I want to say is that I welcome the now that will, I believe, have an impact become the Singapore of Europe. If we're going to become the Singapore of Europe, then it is important that we become a most attractive place for investment. And I believe that low corporation taxes are one of the ways of doing that. I also am concerned that aviation is an important industry for Northern Ireland because of our limited links with the rest of the UK, and also the importance of international links for a place like Northern Ireland, which is an exporting area. And yet there was no specific mention of the aviation industry, but I note that even in the midst of this crisis which the aviation industry is facing, air passenger duty is going to go up by 50%. The take from air passenger duty is going to go up by 50% over the next year. And over the period of I think that if the Chancellor is really aware of the difficulties being faced by the aviation industry, he does need to look again at the whole area of air passenger duty and how we improve connectivity and how we improve and sustain and support that industry, which has been one of the hardest hit after hospitality by the coronavirus restrictions. The other point that I want to make in conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that there are opportunities for tax increases, and indeed with opportunities for tax increases which will not actually hurt businesses and hurt individuals in the United Kingdom. As a result of Brexit, we do now have the opportunity to tackle those people who have been avoiding taxes wholesale. The Amazons and the Googles, who use the Irish Republic as a place where they can locate, take all their profits to, load all their costs into the GB and to the United Kingdom, and then avoid our taxes. And I believe that there are important opportunities that the Chancellor needs to take. And I'm disappointed that even with the announcement of additional inspections for tax fraud, that the amount is so small. And I believe that one of the reasons is that you don't just need new inspectors, you need new policies. And we should be getting on with that. But all in all, I think that for many people in Northern Ireland, they will recognise as a good budget for the Union, a good budget for individuals, and a good budget for recovery.
Very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to welcome this budget on behalf of my constituents in Murray and people across Scotland. There was a lot of good news in what the Chancellor had to say today. But I want to pick up on a few remarks, first of all, on the speech made by the leader of the Scottish National Party. First of all, he accused members of this government of not understanding what it's like to be poor. Quite an incredible statement from someone who earned his fortune as an investment banker in the City of London before he rediscovered himself as a humble crofter. Yes, he also went on to say that this budget lacked ambition. Well, I felt there was ambition weaved throughout. From their government. And the final point I want to focus on from the Right Honourable Gentleman's speech was his comments about business rates and how in Scotland there has been an extension to the freeze on business rates for a further year. And that is true. But that further freeze for another 12 months was only made possible, accepted by the SNP Finance Minister, because of an additional £1.1 billion of support from the UK Government to the Scottish Government. Kate Forbes stood up in Holyrood and said she was only able to do this coming from the UK Government to Holyrood. So that is why we had the extension for a full year of business rates in Scotland. And the Right Honourable Gentleman mentioned newspapers were also covered. Of course, the SNP had to be forced to include newspapers in that business rates relief. A vote by the Scottish Conservatives in Holyrood, which they were against to begin with, forced a U-turn, and I will leave it to others to speculate why the SNP at this time would not be wanting to support the newspaper industry in Scotland. But throughout the last year, dealing with this pandemic, the UK Government has delivered unprecedented support for Scottish families and businesses. The furlough scheme and the self-employed income support, protecting 930,000 Scottish jobs, loans to over 90,000 Scottish businesses, and an extension of the reduced rate of VAT for hospitality, leisure and tourism. The £20 per week uplift for universal credit to help those in our society who need it most, something I've been calling for since October of last year. And £9.7 billion of additional funding for Scottish public services. And with this budget, the Chancellor is continuing those vital lifelines, extending furlough and the self-employed income support until September. Just as this pandemic has gone on longer than any of us could have imagined back in March last year, so too has the broad support delivered by the UK Treasury to the people of Scotland. Yet this wasn't just a budget for helping the Scottish economy to survive the pandemic. It was also a budget for our recovery as well, with investments to support the economy in the North East and its transition towards green energy, accelerating the transformative funding for Scottish growth deals to bolster the local economies in Ayrshire, Argyll and Bute and Falkirk. And a freeze on the fuel duty to back Scottish drivers, something crucially important to our remote and rural areas. And just look at how that contrasts with the SNP Scottish Government lobbying for an increase in fuel duty. That's gone widely unreported, but the SNP are calling for an increase when we look at the options for fuel duty. How will that go down with voters in rural Scotland in a few weeks' time? And of course, as the MP for Murray, representing more Scotch whisky distilleries than any other MP in this place, I warmly welcome the freeze on spirits duty. Hugely important to the distilleries in my constituency and indeed the wider alcohol producers in Scotland and across the UK. This budget shows that the UK Government has a plan to rebuild Scotland's economy after the immediate health crisis is over. The Chancellor said the majority of these measures are applying across the United Kingdom. We have a further £1.2 billion of spending going to the Scottish Government. We need to see the Scottish Government ensuring that gets to the services and the businesses who need it most. And the stamp duty freeze. We now see that holiday continuing in England until September, but in Scotland we need to see action on that in Scotland as well. Yet members on the SNP benches cannot welcome this plan. They could not support the budget because they would rather focus on another divisive independence referendum than our recovery from coronavirus. They've said they want to bring this referendum forward at the earliest opportunity, just when people are renewing their ties with friends and families and businesses are beginning to reopen. Madam Deputy Speaker, their plan would not only damage our Scottish recovery, but that of the whole of the United Kingdom. That is the last thing we need right now. What families and businesses across Scotland want to hear from the Scottish Government is a full route map for ending restrictions, not a route map for separation. As I said earlier, they are looking for certainty and for hope. This budget has delivered that by extending the vital lifelines that Scottish families and businesses are relying on. It's now time for the Scottish Government to do the same. The Chancellor has set out an ambitious programme that will not only secure the survival of many jobs and businesses in Scotland, but also provide that basis for our economic recovery in the future. There was just one point that I agreed with the leader of the SNP on. He said Scotland has a choice of two futures. We do. In the coming Scottish Parliament election, voters will decide whether they want to focus of all the politicians and all the parties within the Scottish Parliament to be on another independence referendum or on rebuilding Scotland from coronavirus. Let's not choose more damaging division and the whole of the UK together. Today's budget will help us do that. Thank you.
We now go via video link to Seema Malhotra, after which the time limit will go down to 5 minutes. Seema Malhotra.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The extension of furlough and the maintaining of the universal credit uplift are a relief. Cutting universal credit at this time would have been unthinkable, and I thank everyone who joined with Labour in making this point. The Chancellor should have announced this sooner. Last-minute changes and U-turns have become the hallmark of this government, with us now facing the worst economic crisis of any major economy. The government U-turned last week on the £500 test and trace support payment so that parents who stay at home because their children have to self-isolate aren't forced to go without pay or to take annual or unpaid leave. But today he's failed to extend the uplift to those on legacy benefits, including many with disabilities, without explanation. Madam Deputy Speaker, the pandemic in our economy, in family finances and in our institutions. We've witnessed the struggle of a weakened and poorly equipped NHS and a social care system after 10 years of the Conservatives. Even before the pandemic, a quarter of households had less than £100 in savings. Madam Deputy Speaker, Step Change has said that 1.2 million people now face severe problem debt, a figure which has doubled since the beginning of the pandemic. My local food banks are struggling with stories of children turning up without clothes, clean clothes to wear. We need to plan now so that we don't emerge less equal as a society. We saw nothing today that will help that. No pay rise for social care workers. Instead, a forced rise in council tax. The increase in the national minimum wage seems to be a U-turn on the 49p an hour promised last March. The increase in apprenticeship incentives comes on the back of widespread criticism of the apprenticeship levy, with there's a gender impact too. Before the coronavirus pandemic, women, especially low-paid, disabled and minority ethnic women, were more likely than men to be in debt. 61% of those getting into debt to purchase everyday necessities are women. And his speech failed to mention children. 4.2 million children were living in poverty before the pandemic, 9 in a classroom of 30. Removing the 2-child limit and the benefit cap would lift hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty, but he chose not to. 500,000 people are behind on their rent due to the pandemic. Mortgage prisoners, those trapped with their existing lender on high interest rates, are paying hundreds of thousands a year extra in mortgage payments to vulture funds and inactive lenders. Forbearance measures are still urgently needed, and a plan to tackle child poverty. Madam Deputy, is hitting the youngest as well as the oldest hardest. Around 600,000 young people are without work, risking a lost generation. Even before the pandemic, and there were around 800,000 people aged 50 to 64 not in work who wanted to be. We need a plan for employment to match the scale of the crisis. That's why it's inexplicable that at the height of the pandemic, work coach hiring almost stopped, with less than 15 work coaches hired from April to June as caseloads more than doubled to over 280 per work coach last summer. His Kickstart scheme has been more of a false start, with only 2,000 placements to date, and Restart hasn't started at all. That's why we need Labour's new jobs promise to guarantee young people aged 16 to 24 unemployed for over 6 months, a training or jobs placement, and to extend the same guarantee to those aged over 24 unemployed for over 12 months. And thirdly, investment and green growth across every region and nation of the UK. Madam Deputy Speaker, as we recover from the pandemic, we must invest at speed for growth. A jobs recovery needs a green recovery. Labour's Green Economic Recovery Report would have been a good read for the Chancellor, with plans to spur job creation across the country, including 400,000 green jobs, with many for young people. Just as Britain led the world into the first industrial revolution, swift and targeted government investment and coordination with the private and voluntary sectors is needed to stimulate the economy and jobs. And on good jobs, the Mayor of London's new Good Work standard is the kind of thinking we need to tackle the scourge of low-paid, insecure work, along with flexible recruitment and workplace well-being plans. We should be investing in community-led co-ops. We should see the employment bill come before Parliament. We urgently need a better sector-specific deal to support jobs, to help airports, airlines, and those in the wider supply chain, the ground handlers, caterers, and other businesses critical for aviation and for our economy and trade. Employment in aviation communities like Feltham and Hessen has been hit very hard and needs much stronger leadership from the government right now. We should lead the way in the world on zero carbon aviation, but this means accelerating R&D investment to support innovation in the future of green transportation and logistics, and for new technologies to be contributing to greater productivity for businesses in our supply chains. Madam Deputy Speaker, today's budget needed to put in place the strong foundations to support businesses and to give security to resilience for a competitive future and for shared prosperity for all. Sadly, it fell far short.
Video link to Simon Fell. Are we having some trouble getting to Simon Fell? I don't have Simon Fell. Okay, what I'm going to do is go to Colm Eastwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Thank you to Simon. To the member for East Antrim, talking about the value of the union as if no other country in the world was investing in businesses and people at this very difficult time. Of course, they're doing it in the Republic of Ireland in a very generous way as well. And I know he's left his place, but I've heard a proposal for after a new Ireland comes into place that there will be a statue erected to the member of East Antrim for all of the work that he's doing to encourage the people of Northern Ireland to vote for a very different constitutional future on that. Maybe Sammy will join us. I find it interesting to hear the Chancellor earlier speaking about whatever it takes and taking lots of credit for the necessary and essential furlough scheme. I mean, I can remember, I don't know if anybody else can, I can remember him being dragged, kicking and screaming almost, to extending the furlough scheme at Halloween. And that left businesses confused and not knowing what they were going to do, and people lost their jobs as a result of it. So it is good, of course, that it's being extended. There should never have been a doubt about that. in my view. I also note, Madam Deputy Speaker, very little mention of the B word. Brexit was hardly talked about in the Chancellor's speech. I wonder, is that because the OBR have said today that there will be a reduction of 0.5% in GDPR in the first quarter alone because of Brexit? You know, many people, myself included, warned of the impact of Brexit. It wasn't heard, and pretending that this is going to be the sunny uplands are coming as a result of Brexit is just beginning to be proven wrong every passing week. That plus the millions of pounds of funding from the European Union that is being stripped of the people from the people of Northern Ireland and not replaced at all, not one penny replaced by this government. It just shows you, I think, where this government's priorities lie when they relax the rules for the City of London and strip the people of Northern Ireland with unreplaced funds. I mean, we've heard, and I think these will be proven to be fairly empty, a lot of talk about levelling up for the north of England. Well, where's the levelling up for the north of Ireland? I mean, we know that the protocol, despite what some people want to allege, the protocol is a benefit to us as a result of a very hard Brexit, because it allows our businesses to trade into the British market, and also that is a competitive advantage that nowhere else on these islands has. Where's the effort to maximise that about how damaging the protocol is? It's just not the case. Note, there's nothing to do in this budget around the skills gap in Northern Ireland. We send thousands upon thousands of people away from our shores to study elsewhere. They don't come back, and that's of very highly skilled people. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not somebody who would ever or normally support low corporation tax, but the very fact of the matter is, in Donegal today, just across the border, corporation tax is 12.5%. In Derry, a mile away, very soon it'll be 25%. That will be, so you take an advantage that you have with the protocol, and then you harm it by having a double the corporation tax just across the border. And we know that small retailers are on their knees. Not a mention of a windfall tax for Amazon, who are making an absolute fortune at the expense of those retailers. And I know I'm running out of time, Madam Deputy Speaker, but in terms of health, the Chancellor says that the NHS is deserving of immense praise. They don't want your praise. They want more money. They want more money in their pockets, and they want more money in the system. In Northern Ireland, we are 30 times smaller in terms of population to England. Our waiting lists are 100 times longer. Where's the investment in our health service to get us out and through COVID, and to begin to allow people to get proper access to the health service that they deserve? The Northern Ireland Executive have announced a £500 million thank you payment for those workers, waive the taxes on it, and allow them to keep the money for themselves.
We now turn to Simon Fell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thanks for coming back to me. I hope my internet holds up now. It's incredible to think that the budget last year didn't even contain the word furlough. 12 months on, the focus was on levelling up. Now it's quite rightly on recovery, and on how that recovery can drive growth in communities like mine and up and down the country. The scale of the support from the government is simply staggering. 65 billion in this budget alone, and closer to 407 billion in total. All of us in this place have perhaps become too used to the idea that if we make the right case, financial support will flow from the Treasury. Of course, in these challenging times, it's not difficult to find people and organisations who are worthy of support. And that's why I believe that this is a truly bold budget, where my right honourable friend has been honest with the British people on the difficult decisions that lay ahead, while maintaining a clear focus on supporting people through COVID and on jobs and growth as we move to recovery. I hold my hand up and I acknowledge that I've been one of those asking Oliver Light for a little bit more, please, sir. This has no doubt been wearing at times, so I'd like to thank my right honourable friend and his fantastic Treasury team for being open to colleagues with ideas and listening to those of us with our bowls out in good grace. And it's that spirit of generosity that I think employed people get support as access to grants is widened, This is the response of a Chancellor and a Treasury team that understand what lifeline these schemes are and how crucial they'll be to recovery and retaining jobs as we emerge from this pandemic. Similarly, the extension to the universal credit uplift is so very welcome. The uplift has brought so many people help through the extreme challenges of this pandemic. Its continuation is not cheap, but for the many people who've been pushed into the category of just about managing in this crisis, it is a lifeline to them. This hand up to those who need it is yet another policy compassionately delivered in the face of incredibly challenging circumstances. Taken together, these measures will protect livelihoods across the UK and provide peace of mind and the ability for fresh breath as we leave lockdown. Walking down Dalton Road in Barrow, Madam Deputy Speaker, you can't get away from the very visible signs that our high street is struggling. My local business owners campaigned hard to gain support. They so very much want to be part of that recovery, and I'm delighted that my right honourable friends recognise the important role they've got to play. The combination of generous restart grants for retail businesses and greater support still for hospitality and leisure, who've been particularly hard hit by coronavirus restrictions, is very welcome indeed. If we in Cumbria want to boost tourism, we need our pubs, bars and restaurants to weather this storm. Restart grants, extending the VAT cut and a freeze in alcohol duty will make all the difference. The 100% business rates holiday last year provided a safety net for so many. Seeing that continue with 75% cut next year will help our high streets play the part they want to in this recovery. I was elected, Madam Deputy Speaker, to a community that felt left behind and that it hadn't seen investment for decades. In the last year alone, we've seen that corner turned, with 25 million awarded in the town deal, a bypass funded at Grisbeck, and I'm incredibly grateful to colleagues from the Treasury and across government for enabling that to happen. And I'm delighted that there's even more for Barrow and Furness and for communities like mine in this budget. The £150,000 in levelling up capacity funding for Barrow will enable my council to put forward a good bid for the Levelling Up Fund. Winning that will make a tangible difference to our town. Similarly, the £20,000 Community Renewal Fund, which has been granted to Barrow, will help us pilot new approaches to tackle some of the most difficult issues we're facing now, supporting new approaches to tackling poverty and reinforcing our community as a place where people want to live, work and visit. The huge capital allowance bonus for manufacturing is also an incredible boon for some of the latent investment which we know is out there. For communities like ours with strong manufacturing bases, from defence to subsea, from world-class LED lighting firms to global exporters. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a remarkable budget for the North and for the whole of the UK. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, for his honesty at the scale of the challenge we face, but also for his determination to support people and businesses through this storm. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Selwood.
Much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It certainly has been a year like no other, and when we look back at this point, we will of course reflect on the direct consequences of this pandemic, the impact to livelihoods and the loss of life, and the incredible efforts of the NHS, the military, and indeed the volunteers in getting us through this. But we will also look to see how responsible we were in supporting and protecting jobs, businesses and skill sets of our economic activity to be revived once it was safe to do so. And with plans to gradually ease lockdown about to start, this budget has two simple objectives. Firstly, short-term fiscal support that will assist our workforce until June, when the lifting of any final COVID restrictions takes place. And secondly, the introduction of responsible measures designed to begin to rebalance the books after a year of record borrowing. So I very much welcome the Chancellor's announcements of further economic support relating to the pandemic, extending the furlough scheme, the continuation of the business rates holiday, extensions of the VAT cuts, for example, and the freeze of alcohol duties. These will all be a pre-reform East, where tourism and hospitality are so critical. But I also make clear that there are calls, people wanting to see lockdown move faster. But no general would commit to a date in achieving the next phase of battle beyond the aspirational until set conditions were met in order to advance. And that's exactly what the Prime Minister is doing now. Now, turning to the longer-term measures, again, when the Chancellor has announced, some of them have received criticism in relating to the manifesto commitments of big taxes, not being touched: income tax, national insurance and VAT. But that was before this once-in-a-century event. And we would be storing up problems for the future if we did not take the initial steps to deal with the scale of the borrowing that's taking place at the moment. We're just starting to lift our heads above the parapet in relation to this pandemic, and to think we could go beyond survival and repair, and what post-COVID, post-Britain will actually look like. So I very much welcome the initiatives that have been put forward in this budget today: national infrastructure programmes, green investment, and also support for veterans' mental health, all very much welcome. And also the digital rollout, important for services as it's taking over from linking businesses together. And I thank the Chancellor for the investment in the Towns Deal Fund, £21 billion going to Boscombe to help regeneration in the core part of my constituency, something that I've been lobbying on, as indeed has the Council for a number of months. So we're very grateful for that. I mentioned digital, and I don't apologise for raising what I call, or what's been referred to as the Rockefeller. J.D. Rockefeller was the owner of the company Standard Oil that dominated the oil market in the 1920s. But it took the will of a president there, Theodore Roosevelt, the one person more powerful than Rockefeller, to see Standard Oil's monopoly challenged and subsequently dismantled. And I'm glad to see the Financial Secretary in his place. There is a clash that we've seen between Google and the Australian government. And with the life of the advertising market, there are big questions as to how personal data is harvested, fair competition is supported, and indeed, pertinent to today, is the levels of taxation that are paid. So I do hope this is something that perhaps can be raised at the G7 discussions that take place this year. My final point is actually in relation to China and the scale of impact that this economic powerhouse is having on the areas of interest that we have across the world. It is a superpower, and it's having a geopolitical challenge in the long term, ensnaring many countries into trade deals, infrastructure and security programs that they can ill afford. This is in direct challenge to the very areas that we want to do business with as well. Again, something for the G7 to discuss. Madam Deputy Speaker, we must recognise that as we come out of this pandemic, the world is looking very, very different to what it did like when we went in. And our economic security depends on our national security and vice versa. Integrated review will give clarity as to what global Britain means. We have become little risk-averse in the last few years in challenging potential threats at source. And I do hope that the tough economic decisions taken today will lead us out of this unprecedented financial shock. And I hope that we can pretty appreciate that the unstable international context that we face is something that we now need to address.
Thank you. Chris Elmore.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the 28th of February, Wales recorded its first case of coronavirus. COVID-19 would go on to turn countless lives, livelihoods and communities upside down. And in my Ogmore constituency, many families have faced an unimaginable loss in unprecedented circumstances. Not just the loss of loved ones, often without being able to say goodbye, or of the precious time with friends and family, but also a previously unimaginable scale of financial loss. Small businesses destroyed seemingly overnight, disappearing jobs, reduced hours, and some people, the excluded, simply falling through the gaps in support and receiving nothing even after their income vanished before their eyes. And I, of course, today welcome the changes that the Chancellor has announced in terms of supporting some of the excluded. But there are still far too many people who are missing out on government support and have been simply bypassed again by this Conservative government. The emotional scarring of the pandemic will be with us for years to come, and we must do all we can to provide the support to mental health and well-being that people need. And I'm very proud that the Welsh Labour Government has already identified the need for this and has begun to implement this support as they seek to move Wales forward. But we need to recognise that alongside the emotional burden, there is also an economic burden. And 15 people in Ogmore are currently furloughed, and 2,705 people are claiming unemployment-related benefits. Months ago, I and my Labour Party colleagues called on the Chancellor to end the speculation and uncertainty surrounding the continuation of this support, and pledged that he would extend the £20 uplift beyond April. I was proud to do the right thing and vote for the £20 per week uplift to universal credit. as I have seen the difference it has made in people's lives across my constituency. Madam Deputy Speaker, while Labour were taking action, the UK government decided to sit on its hands and pretend that no vote was going on. It'll come as no surprise that I find it appalling that I've heard Conservative MPs today say how important the uplift is, but chose to pretend that there was no vote going on just a few months ago, but are now praising the uplift as if the Chancellor has rode in on his white steed and rescued those people who receive universal credit. He could have stopped this speculation many, many months ago. Even this Sunday, the Chancellor was asked by the press if he would end this cliff edge approach to people's income, and again he refused to relieve the anxiety that surrounds families' household budgets. I'm finally pleased that the Chancellor has listened. I have to ask the question, why on earth has it taken him this long to make the decision? Has he perhaps been waiting for a new graphic for his social media? Does his Instagram account do these things? But in the meanwhile, families across my constituency have been living with this uncertainty, and it simply isn't acceptable. The difference between the Chancellor's reluctance to extend this support and the actions of a Welsh Labour government straining every sinew to support Welsh families is glaring. From the get-go, Welsh Labour ensured that the full force of our government was used to support families, businesses and jobs. Be it the barriers grant giving up to £2,000 to contribute towards the essential cost of starting up a business, the restrictions business fund giving businesses a minimum of between £6,000 and £10,000 grants, or releasing £117 million through rate relief for premises over £500,000 back into the economy. Welsh Labour has targeted everything towards protecting jobs in our communities. This budget is not just about tackling the challenges of the present, but is about laying the foundations for the future. And the Welsh Labour Government understands this and does this every day in the work that it is setting out. Over the last 10 years of continuous budget cuts, and I ask the question of the Minister and of the Chancellor, they've spent the last 10 years cutting and cutting and cutting the essential foundations of the economy. And now they're simply expecting, with very little plan and idea, to know how they will progress and build an economy back for the future. With such limited expectations and hopes for growth, it's hardly the inspiring budget that was being briefed daily for weeks before it was delivered today on the floor of the House. The scale of the challenge we face as we seek to rebuild after this dreadful pandemic is immense, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our Welsh Labour Government has recognised this and said our bold and visionary policies we need to move Wales forward. But today's budget is sadly lacking in ambition and in compassion, and in the compassion that is required by the Chancellor and his colleagues. Families in Ogmore and across the UK have made enormous sacrifices in a collective effort to tackle COVID-19 and keep each other safe. They need a plan for a recovery that matches the scale of that sacrifice, but they will not find it in today's budget.
Thank you. I'm afraid that after the next speaker, the time limit will go down to 3 minutes. Mark Harper.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. The first thing I wanted to say, reflecting on the Chancellor's excellent budget speech, is that in an emergency, and that is what we have faced over the last year, it's right for the state to use its fiscal firepower to support the people of our country and protect jobs and livelihoods, and that will be welcomed across the country, but particularly in my constituency of the Forest of Dean. And listening to the Chancellor set out the more than £400 billion worth of spending that's been put in place to support jobs and livelihoods, we can see the payoff, because the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility now thinks that the level of unemployment that we will reach at a peak is considerably lower than it was forecasting just last November. And that reduction in unemployment and those jobs that have been protected will be welcomed in my constituency and across the United Kingdom. I'd also like to just welcome the specific help in the budget for my constituency. I particularly welcome the £150,000 that's going to go to my local authority to help them put in place the capacity to bid for money from the Levelling Up Fund. And of course, because members of Parliament are integrally involved in that, I look forward to working with them to put in place an ambitious plan to help improve the economic conditions in my constituency. I also welcome the continued reduction in VAT for hospitality and tourism businesses and the extension of the business rates holiday. I know that will be incredibly welcome to those businesses in my constituency that are raring to go to get back into business but are not yet enabled to do so. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, because we've had that big one-off amount of borrowing to get us through this crisis, we do need to get the public finances back in shape. And the Chancellor set out very clearly why that is essential. Firstly, because if debt continues rising, we are very vulnerable to a rise in interest rates. A 1% rise in interest rates, modest by historical standards, would mean us having to find £25 billion a year in debt interest, which would mean making very significant savings elsewhere on important public services. And secondly, you have to get the public finances in good shape to prepare us for the inevitable future crisis. And as the Chancellor set out, it was only because we took difficult decisions on tax and spending from 2010 onwards that he was able to have the fiscal firepower, have the borrowing capacity to get us through this crisis. And it's right that he wants to leave the public finances in shape either for himself in the future or a potential successor to deal with any crises to come. And it's important, of course, that that can't happen immediately. It can happen over time. And I'm pleased to see in the, again, the independent forecast that we get the budget back into balance by 2025-26 by three mechanisms. By growing the economy faster, and I welcome the mechanisms that he set out today to increase investment, to get businesses really firing on all cylinders. But it also requires controlling the growth in spending, and I'm pleased to see controlled growth in public spending in the numbers. That is going to mean some bending review, and I say to members on both sides of the House, and especially to my own colleagues, it's going to mean making choices, and it's going to mean setting priorities and deciding what we think is important. We can't spend money on absolutely everything we want. As Conservatives, we have to live within our means, and we have to make those difficult decisions. And I hope that as those decisions are made by ministerial colleagues and our Treasury colleagues later this year, that we can all support them. And finally, it means, which is uncomfortable for someone like myself that wants to see lower taxes, it means an increase in taxes. I don't think we're undertaxed, because the tax rises in this budget are going to leave us with the highest tax burden in my lifetime, since before I was born. But I hope they will be temporary, that once we've got the public finances back into shape, then the Chancellor, as he himself says, is a low-tax Conservative. He'll be able to look to continue increasing public spending in line with the growth of the economy, but also be able to reduce taxes so that people can keep more of their hard-earned income, which is central to being a Conservative. So I think it was a very well-judged budget. I think it gets the public finances back into shape, deals with the crisis, the emergency we faced, and prepares us for growth in the years to come, and leaves us in better shape than he found the Treasury. And I commend this budget to the House.
I understand the Honourable Member some technical problems, so we will go to David Mundell. David.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to begin by saying that I believe that today's budget is good news for my constituency. We still need to focus on defeating the pandemic, and the continuing support for local people and businesses is most welcome. Thousands of people in my constituency have benefited from the furlough scheme and the self-employment scheme, but I have lobbied particularly hard to persuade the Chancellor to retain the £20 uplift on universal credit. So most vulnerable people in my constituency elsewhere receive the support they need. I also lobbied for a VAT cut for the hospitality industry, which so many local businesses were in touch with me about, and this will make a real difference to them as they gradually are allowed to reopen. The Chancellor announced a range of other measures to help businesses in England, and we need to see the equivalent delivered here in Scotland, unlike previously when the Scottish Government has sat on money it received from the UK Government and failed to distribute it quickly to businesses. I've always argued that a car is a necessity, not a luxury, in our rural communities, and haulage fuel costs contribute so significantly to the cost of living locally. That's why I've always opposed rises in fuel duty, and so I'm delighted the Chancellor agrees and has frozen fuel duty yet again. In the very short time I have, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to just focus on the issue of access to cash. It was announced this morning that contactless payments would be increased to £100, which I am sure will be welcomed by many. But what the Chancellor did not reference this year, which he did in his last budget, was the operation of the UK cash system and his plans to legislate on access to cash. Our system of cash faces three big issues: the ongoing issue of access, the inverse issue of depositing cash, and the increasingly pressing problem of acceptance of cash. The issue of acceptance of cash has been made more acute by the pandemic. The Bank of England noted in its quarterly bulletin that 42% of people had recently visited a store that would not accept cash, and which conducted a survey which found that 4 in 10 of those who had experienced difficulties paying with cash had left empty-handed when trying to buy groceries. Therefore, it is absolutely essential that the government come forward with legislation and plans on this issue. Without that, we risk crashing into a cashless society where some 17% of adults in the UK, around 8 million, would struggle. Communities such as my Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweeddale constituency.
We now go to Geraint Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Chancellor failed to mention that in the UK we've got the highest coronavirus death rate in the world, 123,000 deaths. We've got the deepest recession of the G7. And he failed to mention the bungled Brexit that's led to a 2/3 cut in our exports since the new year. The budget, of course, simply continues to increase inequality, which itself will reduce the rate of growth. And whilst pumping money in the economy, we look forward to council tax rises, pay freezes for public sector workers, benefit squeezes and service cuts that will further increase inequality. What we need is a healthier, fairer, greener future. And we've only got to look to the Welsh Government on how to do that, because in England, the excess deaths of COVID over the 5-year average are 20%. In Wales, they're only 13%. And if that rate had been applied in England, there would be 36,000 fewer deaths. How? Well, a more cautious approach to social distancing, travel limits, earlier lockdown, and of course contact tracing in public hands rather than the hands of sponsors of the Conservative Party. And also we're rolling out the vaccination very quickly. Indeed, in Labour government using the money where it's most needed, not supporting council tax for relief for food superstores who are making exceptional profits, not for stamp duty for holidays for people buying second homes, but a £2 billion resilience fund and the Development Bank of Wales investing in small business to secure 141,000 jobs. This is a successful devolution, but we do need the tools to do the job. And we only get 2% of the money for rail investment for 5% of the population. We do need a high-speed link between Bristol, Cardiff, Swansea and West Wales to help connect the Union. We do need the Shared Prosperity Fund that's spent in Wales for Wales by Wales. We do need a Swansea Bay tidal lagoon that was promised, and we need electrification of the railways. There's much we need, but we aren't getting our fair share, and we didn't hear much about that or anything about it in the budget. We need a fairer future in Britain. There's 6.6 million people who are in hunger and food insecurity each day. We need to double the amount of cooperatives. We need to target investment in smaller companies which are committed to net zero, in particular with local jobs, with a reduce inequality. We need to invest in children from poorer backgrounds who've lost most out in terms of education. Invest in sustainable transport. After all, 64,000 people are dying prematurely from toxic air. Nothing about that again. Labour, of course, increased the size of the economy in the 10 years to 2008 by 40%, and in so doing, doubled the health service and the education service. We need a Labour government to have inclusive growth and to balance the books, and we won't get one until we get the next election.
We're now returning to Barry Gardner.
Today, the Chancellor has been dealing with the economic cost of coronavirus is a zoonotic disease. And just like SARS and Ebola, it has come about as the result of the increasing stress that human activity has put on the natural world. As a result of coronavirus, the Chancellor admitted borrowing a record £355 billion, and for the first time in over 50 years, public debt has risen above 100% of GDP. I'll say it again, coronavirus is a zoonotic disease. There will be others. Our species is grappling not just with one global pandemic, but with the two global emergencies of climate change and the destruction of nature through biodiversity loss. Today should not just be about the allocation of money, it should be about the management of our assets. Once we understand that our economy is bounded by nature, natural capital, we will perhaps understand the need to stop consuming each year the goods and services that the planet takes 1.6 years to reproduce. Economists call this living beyond our means. The Intergovernmental Panel is clear we need urgent and unprecedented transformational change. If this budget had adopted the principles of the Dasgupta Review, we would have got that change. It would have set out the basis of a green industrial revolution with full investment in low carbon infrastructure and the greening of our economy. It could have created 1 million new jobs. Protecting jobs and maintaining incomes through furlough is only a baseline. Alongside it, the Chancellor should have put in place incentives from companies to spread employment through job sharing, whilst using their non-employed hours engaged in new paid national retraining scheme for zero carbon industries of tomorrow. That would have been transformational and given people currently in old industries hope and security for the future. Yes, set targets for electric vehicles, but retrain the mechanics. Yes, bring more solar and wind arrays, but train the new generation of engineers. Yes, retrofit our homes, but where is the skilled workforce to carry out the work? On the super deduction of 130% tax release on investment, the Chancellor should have said that this could only be used for sustainable green investments and not subsidise what could be environmentally damaging infrastructure by oil and gas corporates. No wonder it took him precisely 37 minutes into his speech before he even mentioned the word green, and that ironically came just after saying there'll be no fuel duty rise. I welcome what the Chancellor said about changing the remit of the Bank of England to consider environmental sustainability and net zero, but a transformative budget would have mandated both climate and nature-related financial disclosures for listed companies. He patted himself on the back and said that he'd be ready when the next crisis comes. The truth is, the next crisis is already here. It's called the climate catastrophe. It's called environmental destruction. And this budget has not prepared us to meet it.
To Robert Halfon.
I welcome this budget. It has 5 core purposes: to balance the books, help people through COVID, to cut the cost of living, to champion education, skills and apprenticeships, and to build back better. The fundamentals of levelling up must be about cutting the cost of living. Too many of my Harlow residents are working long hours for low pay. That is why the fuel duty freeze for the 10th year is such good news. The national living wage rise to £8.91 in April will mean that households are £5,200 better off compared to 2010, and cuts in taxes have put £1,205 more in the average worker's pocket. The 6-month extension to the uplifting universal credit will incentivise work and reduce the welfare poverty trap. COVID-19 has been a national disaster for education. The government's £1.7 billion catch-up fund is a huge step forward. Just as the NHS has a 10-year plan, there should be a long-term plan for educational recovery, investing in early years, establishing family hubs in every town, reforming the pupil premium to give more help to the long disadvantaged and academic catch-up. I hope the Treasury will hypothecate £150 million raised from the sugar tax to finance school breakfasts in disadvantaged areas. Evidence shows this increases educational attainment by 2 months. The £2 billion Kickstart programme for businesses and the Lifetime Skills Guarantee will rocket boost apprenticeship levy reform to benefit companies that invest in skills our country needs and ensure those from disadvantaged backgrounds climb on the apprenticeship ladder of opportunity. Of course, levelling up means renewing infrastructure. The new hospital plan for Harlow is hugely welcomed by residents, as is our new £81 million Junction 7A and planned regeneration funding of up to £76 million. The expected move of Public Health England to Harlow will provide thousands of jobs, boost skills, health, science and economic opportunities across the east of England. The Health Department has already spent over 270 million for the relocation of the government's commitment to Harlow. Build Back Better must also mean genuinely affordable housing. 1 million children live in overcrowded accommodation. The 12.2 billion announced by the Community Secretary is welcome. The government could incentivise housing associations by a flexible grant rate and making more land available for social housing. Of course, Conservatives are for home ownership. The mortgage guarantee is superb, but we should also be the party of quality, affordable housing. But I commend this budget. I urge the Prime Minister and Chancellor to ensure that supporting workers, championing social justice and the ladder of opportunity continue to be at the heart of government decision-making.
Liam Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm here to speak for the West Midlands because we have a Tory mayor who is failing to use country. And the truth is, over the last 4 years, life in our region was getting shorter, it was getting poorer, and it was getting less safe. That is why what we needed from the Chancellor today, Madam Deputy Speaker, was a budget that genuinely levelled up this country so that we can level up our region. I'm grateful for the help in the short term that will make a difference. But the truth is, over the medium term, we £1 billion worth of tax rises that will also fall on teachers and nurses and police officers for the years to come. That is the biggest tax rise that I think we've ever seen in budget history, and it is so high because the growth rate for this country is now coming further and further down. That is why what we needed from the Chancellor today was a meaningful strategy to go from the pandemic to the Paris Agreement, a plan that would set out a plan to reindustrialise our country, to create the new green manufacturing jobs of the country, avoiding the perils that the IMF is warning about of a K-shaped recovery, where the rich go in one direction and the poor go in another. That's what I want for our region. I want for the world. I want our region, the youngest region in Europe, to be the place with the best life chances for young people. I want our region to be a place where we have police back on the streets, because we've had violent crime that has soared by over 100% over the last 2 to 3 years. But that is not what we got today. We have asked for help, but we've been given just 5% of the £3 billion we asked for to get our recovery moving. And what did we get today? The grand total of £2 per person per week. That was it. There is £431 billion in the national capital budget. What did we get today? We should have got an extra £7.7 billion. That would reflect our population share. We got just 3% of that money today. So I'm afraid that once again, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have been left behind, looked over and left out. The towns funds that we secured today, just 3/4 of what Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham have got up in the North West. Just 39% of what was secured by council leaders in the East.
Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In welcoming today's budget, I wish to focus on 3 themes. Firstly, supporting Restart. The Chancellor is right to ensure that the workforce and businesses are supported as we open up our economy once again. The continuation of furlough, help for the self-employed, business rate relief and extending temporary VAT reduction will give business the confidence to reopen and plough on. We now really have to encourage people to turn their backs on the lockdown, to get back to their offices, back to hospitality and leisure venues, and do their bit for the nation's economy as we unlock, in the same way that they did for the nation's health when they locked down. Secondly, recovery. The Chancellor is right to invest in our recovery by supporting capital projects which will deliver a yield to UK PLC. Over half of the infrastructure spend is devoted to transport. It's vital that this spend goes on projects which deliver the biggest bang for the buck, not white or green elephants. Thirdly, repayment. The pandemic has seen a government fiscal injection of £407 billion. Much of this has been supported across this House. As the Chancellor has said, this is comparable only to the borrowing from World Wars I and II. National debt now stands at £2 trillion. Man, woman and child. We have a record peacetime deficit. To those who talk of low levels of government borrowing, can I just remind them that an increase of just 1 percentage point across all interest rates will add an extra £25 billion a year to the government's cost of servicing the national debt, money that could otherwise be spent on investing in education or delivering infrastructure. So with regret, I understand the need for a 5-year personal tax allowance freeze, corporation tax increases to 25% from 2023 and other tax-raising measures. The OBR has stated that these tax rises will take the overall tax take and burden to the highest level since 1960s. In addition to increasing the tax yield, we also need to reduce the levels of public spending. This means cuts across the board. I'm deeply disappointed that we are reducing our international aid spending, but I cannot just expect spending cuts to apply to those areas less close to. It was 30 years ago that Margaret Thatcher was taking questions from the media on the 1981 budget. She said this, and it applies as much today. What really gets me is this, that it is very ironic that those who are most critical of the extra tax are those who are most vociferous in demanding the extra expenditure. And what gets me even more is that having demanded that extra expenditure, they are not prepared to face the consequences of their own action and stand by the necessity to get some of the tax to pay for it. She concluded, "I wish some of them had more guts and courage than they have." The Chancellor has shown today he has the guts and courage. It's now down to those of us who similarly believe in fiscal responsibility and in not dumping the next generation into an ever-increasing pool of debt to be true to the Conservative Party's philosophy and make that same case.
Video link, Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm sure there will be much chest thumping over this budget, but the reality is that many of those most in need of support have been ignored. Furlough has been welcome for some, but for others, including the 3 million excluded who have not received a penny, this budget offers nothing. The 10 million for veterans' mental health is welcome, but many of the veterans and families who contact me do so because of a lack of support from this government. The Chancellor could have rectified the situation that sees payments awarded for injury in service treated as normal income for DWP calculations, but he didn't. What message is he sending to the veterans who have given their health for this country? The recent National Audit Office report on military housing should have shamed this government. The report talks of decades of underinvestment, with nearly 2,400 personnel living in such abysmal accommodation, lacking basics such as hot water, that they are not even required to pay rent. This is a government that professes to stand up for the armed forces, so why no funds for this? But central to any COVID recovery plan must be our children. This is a year where disadvantage has been laid bare, and whilst the government has rightly provided digital devices and tutoring schemes in order to learn, children need first to be fed. The Chancellor has agreed to maintain the £20 a week uplift in universal credit until September, which is of course welcome, but does he really think that beyond September this uplift is not required? He's probably never gone round a supermarket trying to decide which basics he can afford. Well, I have, and I can tell you the difference £20 a week would have made during those times. In contrast, we see the Scottish Government introducing the Scottish Child Payment of £10 a week for every child under 6. So we need a commitment from this government that this uplift will be permanent, that it will apply not just to those on universal credit, but also those on legacy benefit, that children can be fed, and then we can talk about meaningful learning. And finally, I want to talk about the children of Yemen. The UN tell us the humanitarian crisis is the worst in the world. 80% of Yemen's population are in need of humanitarian aid. 4 million people displaced, 400,000 children under 5 are at risk of dying from malnutrition. And amid this crisis, the government makes a manifesto-breaking cuts to international aid. If this is the best that global Britain can deliver, it's no surprise that Scotland's choosing a different path. One of the strengths of the UK was a commitment to international development. The situation in Yemen is critical. A tiny proportion of our borrowed funds must be shared with the world's most desperate.
Number 27 is withdrawn, so straight to Judith Cumming.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is welcome that the Chancellor has committed to keeping key elements of the support packages in place until September. But businesses and families in my constituency need certainty that they will not once again be placed into local restrictions that hurt our local economy. Because last week the Prime Minister left open the possibility of returning to local restrictions to contain new variants. So I urge the government to deal with this national crisis with national measures. During the local lockdown in Bradford, we had the perverse situation of people being able to travel to nearby areas to shop, have beauty treatments and go to the gym, all while our local businesses were forced to close. The closing of local economies like this caused permanent economic damage, and many of our businesses may never recover. This unfairness must not be allowed to happen again. Instead, we need a plan for unlocking and recovery, a plan that closes rather than widens the growing gaps in our economy, and that is not what this budget delivers. On the issue of rebalancing our economy, I was disappointed to see no commitment to Northern Powerhouse Rail in this budget. Nothing is more critical to Bradford's long-term economic success than securing the Northern Powerhouse Rail line with a city centre stop in Bradford. In recent years, I've asked ministers 11 times to confirm that this transformational project would go ahead and that, crucially, it would include Bradford. Time and time again, ministers have responded with warm words but no action. And now I worry that we are backing away from its previous commitments to invest in my region and my city. First, the government asks Transport for the North not to submit its outlined strategic business case as was planned. Then there are suggestions in the media that the government is considering a cheaper route which bypasses Bradford, doesn't include a city centre stop, or doesn't even involve a new line at all. Let me be very clear. Upgrading existing lines will not fulfil the manifesto promise this government made, and nor will it provide the infrastructure improvements that the great cities of the North need. A route which misses out Bradford would be a huge mistake. And this matters. This matters for opening up our economy. This matters for rebalancing our economy. This matters for the job prospects and opportunities for the people in my constituency. And it's time for this government to deliver.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I draw the House's attention to my external interests set out in the Register. I've come this afternoon to praise what I think is an excellent budget, and if you listen carefully, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the two main front bench speeches opposite, it's clear they do not, in truth, think that much of it is wrong. This has been a year in which the government has truthfully used taxpayers' funds to protect livelihoods, to help business and to help the least well off. And it was additional relief today to see that unemployment was not as bad as many of us feared. So the first point I want to make is that this is an excellent budget and it will contribute greatly to Britain coming out of recession and out of this crisis over the coming months. The second point I want to make is that I listened carefully to the Right Honourable Gentleman from Hodge Hill's speech. He's clearly in campaigning mode, but one of the real winners from this today is the West Midlands, and it's a huge tribute to Andy Street, the brilliant mayor that we have. Chancellor together, as have many of members of Parliament in the region. He's done a brilliant job, and what today at getting the government to deliver for the West Midlands. He called for apprenticeship incentives, he called for extending furlough, he called for an extension of the VAT cuts for hospitality and tourism, and he called for cash grants for businesses reopening. And nearly 100 million for the Black Country towns and city centres, a particular issue that he championed, and £59 million for stations to be open. So I want to express my very strong support for the wise way in which he is delivering for the West Midlands, in particular to support his transport plan. And of course we will be looking for more in future as we seek to reopen the Sutton Park line. But the budget today is a triumph for the efforts and hard work of a really brilliant mayor who is delivering for the West Midlands and everyone who lives there. The final and third point I wanted to make, Madam Deputy Speaker, is I was hoping the Chancellor would announce today that this was not the year to cut the 0.7 promise. We have seen over recent days in Yemen vividly what the effect of this will be. Launching Global Britain post-Brexit means it's not the year. In the middle of a global pandemic emphasises that it's not the year. And our chairing of the G7, the only country in the G7 that is cutting development spending, also shows it's not the year to do it. And we would be breaking our promise to the poorest people in the world were this cut to go ahead. Every member of this House was elected just a year ago on a promise to stand by the 0.7. The 0.7 itself reflects our economic circumstances because it has gone down so much, as it must, because the economy has contracted, and that is a big enough cut. So I very much hope the government will think again. At least they must check with the House and have a vote in the House. Brexit is about giving more power to Parliament. The law of the land is point 7 and it needs parliamentary assent for any change.
Video link to Caroline Lucas.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is the last budget before the UK hosts the COP Climate Summit in November, before it presides over the G7 and takes part in the Global Biodiversity Summit. So in that context, the Chancellor should have embraced the enormous potential for a fair and green recovery, to create hundreds of thousands of jobs and to shift our economy onto new sustainable foundations. Climate leadership means deeds, not words. It means following the science on the speed and scale of the investment required to meet climate goals and halt the loss of biodiversity. You know, the question isn't whether we can find a climate initiative here or a mention of green spaces there. I welcome the progress on green bonds and the investment bank. But the question is whether, as a whole, this budget addresses the climate and ecological emergency with anything approaching the ambition or urgency required. And it gives me no pleasure to say that it does not. It is alarming and disappointing to see the Chancellor doubling down on economic dogma that is fueling the fires of the climate crisis and making our society more unequal and less resilient. Because the Chancellor has failed to make space for nature in his red box, it means we're missing out on thousands of jobs that a National Nature Service could create, for example. And more fundamentally, as the Treasury's own Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity explains, biodiversity loss isn't, I quote, undermining nature's productivity, resilience, and adaptability, fueling extreme risk and uncertainty for our economies and well-being. I say in all seriousness, our nation's health and prosperity would be better served by a Chancellor who cared rather more about hedges and hedgehogs and less about hedge funds. I'd like to highlight 3 big omissions from this budget. First, we needed a climate and nature test so that all spending and fiscal measures are aligned with limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees and the UK's other environmental goals. The idea that the Treasury already accounts adequately for nature is farcical. If that were the case, the Chancellor would, at the very least, be restoring funding for the Green Homes Grant. It is shameful that this scheme is being allowed to wind down. We need it. Second, on green jobs, we need transformational investment to create those jobs. With unemployment rising and so much to be done to create the fair and green economy, we could have been investing millions. 48 billion, for example, over 18 months could have created over 1 million good green jobs. In the US, Joe Biden has a $2 trillion plan to address the climate emergency. Maybe there's been some kind of spreadsheet error here in the UK. And finally, in this budget and beyond, the Chancellor must act on the conclusions of the Dasgupta review. It must respect the fact that we should have been having a well-being budget. We should be shifting towards an economic approach fit for the 21st century, not fixated on GDP growth, but properly putting well-being and the health of people and the planet at the heart of this budget.
Video link to Laura Trott.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The first and most important thing that we need to do today is to focus on the real-world impact that the measures in this budget will have. Jenny Pollard lives in Otford in my constituency. She runs a nail business. She's self-employed, and her first year of trading was 2019-2020. The announcement today means that she can access full support for the first time, which will be a lifeline for her and for her business. The Royal Oak Pub, Marco's, the Danish Connection, all brilliant businesses in my constituency whose trading has been affected through no fault of their own in this pandemic. The Restart grants are exactly what they need to help them reopen and exactly the type of support that we've been asking the Chancellor for. This comprehensive and welcome package of support comes, however, at a cost, and we must be honest with the British people about that. The Labour Party talk a lot about fiscal responsibility, but they haven't set out anything which is fiscally responsible. England is to put forward a clear plan for how we're going to start to pay for this support, a plan which provides much needed certainty for business and protect those who need it the most. And I particularly welcome the plan to shelter the smallest companies from the corporation tax rise. But more than that, Madam Deputy Speaker, we know that the best way to recover is to grow. The Honourable Member for Hitchin Harpen and I published a proposal for accelerator zones to encourage regional growth. The paper talked about the need for high-skilled visas, incentives for investment, and networks of support, and I'm delighted to see many of those themes picked up today. We know that the country has a long-term issue with productivity, so these measures will help to address the structural barriers which have been holding our country back. And I was very surprised, Madam Deputy Speaker, to hear the Leader of the Opposition complain about a lack of Not only was the OBR very clear that our interventions have led to 1.8 million fewer people being out of work than would otherwise be the case, but the Right Honourable Member for Holborn and St Pancras seems to be confused about how you tackle unemployment. It is businesses who create jobs. It is businesses who support employment. To tackle unemployment, you must support business and business investment. And with super deductions, the restart grants, furlough, business rates holiday, we're doing exactly that. Proof, if any more were needed, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this is a budget for the recovery now, but also for beyond.
Karen Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've learnt a lot about this Chancellor over the last few days, haven't we, beyond the flashy videos. When asked about the Eat Out to Help Out and the summer schemes, any decent person would have stopped. They would have reflected. They would have said they've learned, they've made mistakes. And that dreadful graph of the rising deaths through last autumn into the winter and after the Prime Minister promised we wouldn't cancel Christmas is a shameful graph. It's shocking, but we've heard no contrition. And worse, we've heard nothing that any lessons have been learnt. That's an affront to our country, and particularly those of us who have lost a loved one too early from this virus. The Chancellor has said he will be honest. Well, let's be honest. The Tory government in 2010 choked off our recovery. They cut back the services we depend on, and the productivity problem we had then has got worse. He said today it's not enough to desire increased productivity. Well, I agree with him on that, but he has done nothing to support it, particularly for young people. EMA scrapped then, early years Sure Start taken back far too early. Lower skills level we now still have, further education still not properly funded, the post-16 per pupil level still shamefully too low. Much more is needed to rescue the apprenticeship programme. I welcome the increase, but that's not enough to make sure that programme gets back on track, and young people have lost so much in this time, haven't they? I'd like to take a moment to thank an organisation, Youth Moves, in my Bristol South constituency, who have supported those young people up for an award tonight. Good luck to them, but they need much more help. What we needed was a fix for those years of underinvestment in Bristol's environment and skills. What we got was a sticking plaster that will go nowhere near what we need to support our problems. No support for the West Country. Either they're expecting to win the Metro Mayor election or they just don't care. We needed action. We didn't get it. The environmental crisis and the green growth that we should be pursuing in order to help young people should have been front and centre of this budget, and it hasn't.